Are you having a hard time figuring out what to get Dad for Father's Day? Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1 and save 15% off your order when you check out Row 1 Brand's Vintage Sports Pictorium Gallery. They have America's best sports art. With over 7,200 historic sports prints, you're assured to find something unique for Dad this Father's Day. If he's an NFL buff, check out the 1963 vintage NFL helmet poster. Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
Jack Quinn made his major league debut in 1909 at the age of 25. A late bloomer, Quinn was as durable as any pitcher before or since, and was determined to pitch into his 50s, and I'll get into that in just a little bit. Howard Ehmke, on the other hand, made his debut in 1915 at the age of 21. He had all the potential in the world, but injuries and sickness plagued his career. Both pitchers wound up on the same team twice, and next, on Sports Forgotten Heroes, I'm going to explore the career of each and talk about the interesting intersections of their careers and how they both overcame obstacle after obstacle over the course of their amazing careers.
This is Sports Forgotten Heroes, a tribute to the stars who shaped the games we love to watch and the games we love to play. Stars who provided us with many thrills, but when their time was up, they faded away. We'll take a look back at their spectacular careers, their moments of fame, even if it was just for one season or just one game. And now, here's your host, Warren Rogan.
Hello and welcome to Sports Forgotten Heroes, episode number 109, Jack Quinn and Howard Ehmke. These two pitchers had remarkable careers. They played during the same time period, and twice they played on the same teams. First with the awful Boston Red Sox of the mid-1920s, and later with one of baseball's greatest teams, Connie Mack's Philadelphia Athletics of the late 1920s and the early 1930s. What these two pitchers did over the course of their careers, proving the naysayers wrong, coming back and overcoming the odds time after time, makes for a great story. And joining me to tell it is Steve Steinberg, co-author of a new book from the University of Nebraska Press called Comeback Pitchers, The Remarkable Careers of Howard Ehmke and Jack Quinn. Steinberg, for those of you who might remember, also joined me on episode number 28 a few years back as we spoke about the wonderful career of pitcher Urban Shocker. What Steinberg and his co-author Lyle Spatz have put together here is just fascinating, and I am very excited to bring this episode to you. And a big thank you to the University of Nebraska Press for sending me a copy of the book, and a belated thank you for also sending a copy of the book Shake and Bake, The Life and Times of NBA great Archie Clark, whom I talked about in episode number 106. So, Jack Quinn, like I said, made his debut in 1909. He came up with the New York Highlanders, now known as the New York Yankees. There is great mystery surrounding Quinn's age, and according to Steinberg, he and Spatz believe Quinn pitched in the majors until he was 51. If that's so, that means he didn't make his debut until he was 27. He pitched for 23 years, missed 2 seasons, and I'll get into all of that with Steve. Meanwhile, Emke was a marvel. He came up with a lot of fanfare, a lot of potential, and possessed Hall of Fame talent. However, he couldn't stay on the field. He dealt with mental lapses throughout his career as well. Still, if not for the decision of an official scorer, Emke's name just might be better known. He would have been the first to have pitched back-to-back no-hitters. And his Game 1 performance in the 1929 World Series is still one of the greatest pitching performances in the history of the Fall Classic. Now, before we get into today's episode, just a little house cleaning. Sports Forgotten Heroes is a proud member of the Sports History Network. Check it out at sportshistorynetwork.com. This is a great site. It's where you can catch podcasts about all sorts of topics related to the yesteryear of sports. Again, that's the Sports History Network. Of course, I invite you to follow Sports Forgotten Heroes on Twitter at SportsFHeroes. Follow Sports Forgotten Heroes on Instagram, and look on Facebook for the Sports Forgotten Heroes page. Also, check out my website, sportsfh.com. This is where you can access past episodes of Sports Forgotten Heroes, ask questions, make comments, suggest forgotten stars of the past for other episodes. Learn more about my guests, and find out more about the forgotten stars I talk about. Again, that's sportsfh.com. As always, if you are listening on Apple Podcasts, please give Sports Forgotten Heroes a 5-star rating, and thank you for listening and for your continued support. Now let's get to today's episode with my guest, Steve Steinberg. Steve, welcome back to Sports Forgotten Heroes. It's been quite some time since we last spoke. I think it was Urban Shocker, but you just came out with a brand new book, and I am so happy you've accepted my invitation to come on back.
Well, I'm glad to be back, and Lyle, Spatz, and I have done our third collaboration. Shocker was a solo effort, but Lyle and I have done 2 other books before this new one, Comeback Pitchers.
Yeah, it's quite the undertaking, I think, that you and Lyle undertook. And maybe one time we'll have to have Lyle here with us.
Sure.
You know, Steve, the book is extensive. There is so much to cover. There is no way possible to get all of it. So we're just going to dive in. And first, just tell us a little bit about who was Jack Quinn. Just give us an overview of Jack Quinn.
Yeah, Jack Quinn was a very good pitcher who had a very long career. He came up with the American League team that would become the Yankees, that were not a dynasty then, in 1909. And his career spanned about 25 years almost in the majors. He was a spitball pitcher and repeatedly was told that he was getting old and washed up, and kept on showing that he had plenty of stuff left. So not a superstar per se, but someone who was very, very good, who continued to pitch, and he owned the record as the oldest pitcher to win a major league game for many, many decades. Jamie Moyer broke it here in the last decade and actually gave us a blurb for our book. A very good and determined pitcher.
Yeah, you know, in fact, I actually wrote it down that when you compare Jack Quinn with someone, I actually wrote down Jamie Moyer. He played for 25 years, and he pitched with the Rockies until he was 49. What about Howard Ehmke? Give us an overview on Howard Ehmke.
Well, Emke, his career started a few years later than Quinn's, and they became teammates on a very bad Boston Red Sox team of the early 20s after the Yankees had stripped them of all their talent, and then became teammates on the rising powerhouse Connie Mack's Philadelphia Athletics that won the championship in 29. And like Quinn, Emke was told that he was washed up. a little bit different here. It was less about age and more because of arm problems that he had. And, we really don't know exactly what those arm problems were back then. They didn't have the medical knowledge and development. Maybe he tore a rotator cuff, but he kept on enduring and ended up being a surprise starter in one of the most stunning World Series games ever in 1929.
Yeah. It's funny you say rotator cuff because I thought about that for a moment. I actually tore my rotator cuff. Wish I could say I was a big league pitcher and that's what did it, but that's not what did it. And the way you described the pain, or he described the pain at one point, I immediately thought about a rotator cuff. Steve, there's a few other topics that I think we need to touch upon before we get into their careers. And that's really what I'd like to discuss today is their careers and not so much about their lives on the periphery. So we do need to bring up the Federal League. Tell us about the Federal League, if you can, its brief existence and its effect on the game during its existence.
Yeah, the Federal League was a competing league to the American and the National. It started out as sort of a Midwestern minor league in 1913, and it was very much modeled on the American League, which basically didn't start until the early 20th century. And the American League challenged the National, and in 1901, after being a sort of a minor league for a year in 1900, started rating the big leagues of talent. And the Federal League then became a major league in 1914. Unfortunately, the timing was not there because the Great War, World War I, was about to break out. The owners of the Federal League were actually, by and large, much wealthier men than the owners of teams in the American and the National League. And many people think that the Federal League lost the war because it only succeeded for 2 years. And we'll talk about it. Both Quinn and Emke went to the Federal League with different success. But if you really look at it, 2 of the owners of the 8 Federal League teams ended up buying major league teams, the St. Louis Browns and the Chicago Cubs. And most of the others were paid enormous sums of money for the league to discontinue. So it's not quite so simple to say they didn't make it. And they didn't survive, but the organized baseball paid an enormous price to make them go away.
One other thing we must discuss is the spitball, and I've touched upon this particularly with a guest I've had on previously, Joe Neese, when we talked about Burley Grimes. Tell us again about the spitball. It was outlawed when Quinn played, but he was still allowed to use it. So tell us about the grandfather clause regarding the spitball.
Yeah, people may not realize the spitball was banned after the 1919 season, along with a number of other trick pitches. And the feeling in baseball was that the game was becoming too much of a pitcher's game. History does tend to repeat itself.
I wonder about that, huh?
Right. And what people don't realize is the spitball was going to be banned totally. And the spitball pitchers, and there were 17 of them, were given the 1920 season to transition. It was, let's be fair, we'll give them 1 year. But what ended up happening was during the 1920 season, these pitchers, including Jack Quinn, and he was a very active one, started promoting their cause. Quinn was famous for going on record and saying, taking away my pitch that I've developed all my career is like reaching into my pocket and taking money. And there was a little concern in Major League Baseball about a new wild card, and that was the new commissioner, Landis. And a lot of the owners were afraid Landis might step in and do something. So at the World Series of 1920, starred Burley Grimes and the Brooklyn team, the Robins, now known as the Dodgers, and Cleveland, the Indians, with Stan Kovalevsky, another spitball pitcher. So that was another good break that Major League Baseball decided, gosh, we've got these star pitchers, we've got this rumbling of protest, let's ban the pitch. That's fine. But for these handful of guys that have pitched it, we'll let them play their game out, their career out. And Grimes actually pitched a little bit longer, I think one season beyond Quinn's 1933. And so these guys kept on throwing that ball.
Mm-hmm. Okay, a little bit of background. Like I said just earlier, you were on previously as we talked about really a fascinating pitcher, a guy by the name of Urban Shocker, a book you said, that you did solo. Tell us what other books that you and Lyle have published.
Yeah, Lyle and I have primarily focused on the Yankees. This book is a little bit of a detour because Emke never was a Yankee. Quinn was. He had 2 stints with them. But we focus on a period primarily of the 1920s and guys that have been overlooked. Our first collaboration was 1921, the Yankees, the Giants, and the battle for baseball supremacy in New York. It was the first year that the Yankees won the pennant, and they had Babe Ruth had just come to town a year before, and the New York Giants made the World Series led by John McGraw. They were really the more popular team. And so that book took a look at the rise of the Yankees. We then did the Colonel and Hug, which was about the partnership between Yankees owner Jacob Rupert, who bought the team in 1915 when they were really terrible, and he hired a few years later Miller Huggins. So that's the Colonel Rupert, and Miller Huggins is the Hug as his manager. And their partnership, their unlikely partnership, really laid the foundation, the dynasty that became the Yankees.
Mm-hmm. Well, why did you decide to write a book that encompassed the careers of both of these guys, Jack Quinn and Howard Ehmke, and not singular books on each? Why did you think you could intertwine their careers like you did, which was, you did it really well?
Yeah, Lyle and I, when we collaborated, is a really true collaboration. We edit each other's work repeatedly through many rounds of edits. And these guys had a common denominator. They were both told that they weren't good enough. And so that's a story that can resonate beyond baseball and, quite frankly, even beyond sport. And they were both, and they were together as teammates and on one of the worst teams in baseball and then one of the greatest teams in baseball. And so it was a challenge to weave them in. But I think the outcome just tells 2 stories about 2 guys that said, hey, we're not going to take the advice of so-called experts that were too old or too washed up. We're still going to continue in our profession.
Mm-hmm. Where did the name of the book come from? Comeback Pitchers. Why that title?
That just seemed appropriate because they repeatedly in their careers did come back from if there had at one point we say if there had been a comeback player of the year award in baseball in that era, they might have each won it multiple times. And of course, the greatest irony or comeback is that the Red Sox, which were such a bad team in the early 20s, gave up on both these men. And Connie Mack, who's been considered one of the great managers in baseball history, and our work in this book is more confirmed our opinion of that. He thought that these guys could contribute and took them from the worst team, and they became key members of the best team. The 29 through 31 Philadelphia Athletics are not often, they don't get quite the attention that the 26 through 28 Yankees do, but that 3-year dynasty following the Yankees' 3-year pennant-winning dynasty was pretty amazing with Lefty Grove and George Earnshaw and Mickey Cochran and Jimmy Fox, and Quinn and Emke were key members of that team.
Yeah, they definitely had quite a fearful lineup filled with Hall of Famers. So the name of the book is called Comeback Pitchers, The Remarkable Careers of Howard Ehmke and Jack Quinn, and it's from the University of Nebraska Press. Terrific book. Really enjoyed reading it. And before we go any further, why don't you let everybody know where they can get a copy of it?
The copy can be gotten anywhere that one wants to get books from. Nebraska Press is offering a promotional price on it. They have a website, but it can be gotten anywhere, whether it's a local bookstore, or Amazon, all the usual places. And like I said, Nebraska Press has done a great job there. They are the home of our other 3 books. They do such a great job in the entire process, from brainstorming with us as we get rolling with it, right through production and layout, and the covers have impact. And we've been very happy to be part of that publishing family.
Sure, and some of the photos in there are really terrific. The clarity, just really good.
Well, I have a particular interest in photos, and have built up a relationship with a number of private collectors in the country. And my goal always has been that I want, in a book that I'm part of, for the pictures to be as unique and special as the content of the book, and really to be revealing. In this case, we were fortunate enough to connect with members of the Quinn and Emke families that provided some pictures that some may have never been seen, and certainly most of them have not been seen for almost 100 years.
Mm-hmm. One of my favorites actually isn't even of Emke or Quinn. It's of the trainer massaging the arm of Lefty Grove.
Right. That picture really made an impact on me, because you realize when you see that picture that Grove was not that big or muscular a guy, as opposed to, let's say, a Jimmy Fox, and yet he was able to get such velocity. His strikeout record was just about unmatched at the time. And, of course, he oftentimes talked about the fact that he got his power from delivering with his entire body, not just his arm. Mm-hmm. That certainly is a special photo.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So, Steve, one of the things I found interesting is how their careers did intertwine. They played together, like you said, on the Red Sox, 1923 and 1924, part of 1925, and then again with the Philadelphia Athletics from 1926 through 1930, and Quinn actually went on a little bit longer than that. But what I found more interesting was the striking difference between the two physically. Quinn was always in shape. He was a big man, never appeared to get hurt. And obviously his stamina and the fact that he kept himself in such good shape, that plays a huge role in his story. While Emke had all the potential in the world, but was, I guess for lack of a better term, a string bean. He was skinny, but he had a huge arm. Health, though, always appeared to keep him back. So talk about what I consider to be the stark differences between the two physically.
Yeah, there's no question that Quinn was an ox of a man. I think he did drink in moderation. He'd have an occasional beer. I don't think he smoked. And he kept in terrific shape, as you mentioned, even in the off season. He would go hunting. He and his wife had a cabin in the wilderness of I think it's northeastern Pennsylvania, and he made no secret of the fact that when he would hunt, he would walk and hike for miles and miles. In the spring, before spring training, he'd go to Hot Springs, Arkansas, where there are still to this day the famous hot baths, the thermal baths, and I visited there as part of our research. And he worked out. He used to pitch in front of a mirror during the off season every day, just go through the motion. And so he was incredibly fit. He started out as really had a great fastball, also being compared to Amos Russi, the incomparable speed pitcher of the late 19th century. Emke, like you said, a great description to call him like a string bean. He was just as slim, as can be, and he just had arm problems. A lot of times when you dig into the past of a pitcher, you really, we don't have diaries, we don't have every possible piece of information, and Emke, sometimes he did complain a bit, constantly having these problems, and we don't know to what extent, I mean, he definitely had some real arm problems, but he also, oftentimes you would hear him complaining about the fact that he was not 100%.
Yeah, I mean, you brought it up in the book, or Lyle, whomever, the two of you brought it up in the book. You know, had his tonsils out one year, was struck by the flu a couple of times. It almost seemed like he was sickly, and it always affected him, particularly in the beginning of a season. He was never ready to go when the season started.
Well, that's very true. And the thing about the tonsils is, just an aside here, there was a lot of commonly held medical belief then that, there was the teeth pulling and the tonsils. I guess I was thinking more of what sometimes the player would have his teeth, some teeth pull, like impacted wisdom teeth, that was poisoning their system and hurting their arms. So medicine has come a long way since that time, but I sometimes think about the fact that even a modern day pitcher with all the trainers and all the technology now could learn something from the determination that these guys had to simply keep on at what they were doing.
Mm-hmm. Well, earlier you said Jamie Moyer, gave you a comment about Quinn. When I read the book, that's who my mind went to as a comparison type for Quinn, was Jamie Moyer, or is Jamie Moyer. I really had a struggle trying to come up with someone to compare Emke to that might give our listeners somewhat of a picture of the kind of pitcher that Howard Ehmke was. And the one name that kept popping up in my head, a guy who certainly didn't have anywhere near the career of Emke, didn't play anywhere near as long as Emke, but ironically was a Tiger, is Mark the Bird Fidrich.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I hadn't really thought about Fidrich per se. Emke was a very cerebral guy, and this may come as a little bit of a surprise to you or the listeners, but in some ways, he too was similar to Jamie Moyer, because, of course, I live in Seattle, so I saw Moyer pitch many times for the Mariners, but like Moyer, Jamie did not have a lot on the ball. And you would come to the plate and thinking, this guy is going to be easy to hit. Mm-hmm. Moyer would have a fastball, maybe that was 82 or 83 miles an hour, and then, of course, his off-speed pitch was a lot slower than that. But he was a very cerebral kind of guy, a really thinking man's pitcher, and location was important. Not that it wasn't important to Quinn. I think all good pitchers know that location is very important. But in many ways, he just wanted to outthink the hitters. And tell me a little bit more about your Fidrich parallel. What other things, if I may ask you a question here?
Yeah, just, I was thinking about arm trouble. I was thinking about tall and skinny. And I was thinking about, that the potential that Fidrich had. He came up. The start to Fidrich's career was certainly a little more electrifying. Not a lot, though, but a little bit more electrifying than Emke. And he had arm trouble. And that's just, I just kept thinking, who am I going to compare this guy to? And for some reason, that's what popped into my head.
Well, that is interesting. The body types are certainly very similar, too. And, yeah.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about Emke and his arsenal. Like, he had a decent fastball, like you said, was cerebral. He was a thinker. He came up with the hesitation pitch. But as much of a thinker as he was, one of the things that you wrote about was he was very often accused of losing concentration for a period of time during a game, and that prevented him from realizing his potential. Talk about that and the kind of pitcher, the arsenal that he did have.
Right. Well, that's, I touched upon it earlier. We don't know to what extent he was held back. There might have been a psychological personality part of him that didn't quite have the determination, even though there's no question that he had to overcome arm problems. But he was a underhand pitcher and a sidearm pitcher and an overhand pitcher.
Can you hold on 1 second, because you're the second guest I have had on recent podcasts that talks about underhand pitching. I can't picture it. Can you tell me what is an underhand pitch? Is that like what Dan Quisenberry used to do? Explain what an underhand pitch is.
Yeah, the arm comes down so low. Of course, Carl Mays, the famous pitcher of the Yankees, who actually hit and then killed with a hit by pitch. The only player in Major League Baseball, Ray Chapman, died. Yeah, and the ball, the pitching arm, basically practically grazes the mound that the pitcher starts from that angle, and it is a very odd angle, and we think that Emke really mixed them up during his career. It's not that he evolved and he went from overhand to underhand or to sidearm. He seemed to have mixed it up quite a bit, and he wasn't enormous, blazing fast. And as you said, there were a number of instances where he had a lead and maybe he let up a little bit and then and lost the lead and a game. But it was pretty unorthodox. The ball is rising as you're coming to hit it rather than coming down.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And tell us a little bit more about Quinn and his arsenal. He didn't use the spitball as much as one would think, and it wasn't as you said, a lathered up spitball either. Tell us a little bit more about the type of pitcher he was.
Yeah, there are some contradictory accounts out there, but he definitely had a great fastball when he began, but Quinn, had a great slow ball, as Urban Shocker did, who we spoke about a few years ago, and Quinn always, mentioned there's a tendency among athletes that if you get into hot water, you've got a difficult situation, you want to do something even more and throw harder, and which is really something that you don't ordinarily have success with, instead of taking a deep breath and playing to your strength and trying to outthink the hitter. But the spitball, you could probably fill me in on whether Grimes slobbered a lot on his spitball, but Quinn had a relatively dry spitter. Just a little bit of moisture on the ball could get it to do funny things, and it could break in unpredictable fashion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can't remember the name of the substance, but it was some sort of sap from a tree, from a particular type of tree that Grimes would get a hold of, and that's what he used as a spitball.
Right, the bark of that tree. Yeah, the name escapes me here right now also, but he was a master. And the ironic thing is that during the teens, when organized baseball wanted to ban the pitch, a lot of the so-called experts were saying, well, it needs to be banned because it's ruining the arms of these pitchers and it's destroying careers. They would use the example of the incomparable Ed Walsh of the Chicago White Sox. But Walsh really had some other issues rather than the spitter. And as it turned out, so many of these pitchers, including Grimes, Quinn, and Red Faber, who's in the Hall of Fame, just to name a few, were able to go on well into their 40s because the spitball was actually a very easy pitch on the arm and not ruining careers. It lengthened them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I said that I want to mostly concentrate on their careers, but I do want to go back to how each was, discovered and the start of their careers. So Jack Quinn started his major league career in 1909 with New York of the American League, going 9-5 with a 1.97 ERA. How was he discovered? And tell us a little more about his early days.
Well, these two guys had totally different origins, and Quinn's was fascinating because he actually came from Eastern Europe. And there's a whole sub-story here because for many years it was thought that he was born in the United States. And together with some Quinn family members, there was some amazing genealogical work it wasn't even me that spearheaded. One of the Quinn family members did, and with the help of a genealogist in what is now the Slovakian Republic, we were able to determine that Jack Quinn did come from there and came as a very small infant. He never really knew all the details of his upbringing. His mother died shortly after his father came to the United States. The girl that took care of him when he was an infant married his father, and subsequently did not want to hear much about wife number one. So there was a lot of mystery there. But so the name Quinn is a whole another disguise of his, because at that time period there was a lot of discrimination against Eastern Europeans, and if you wanted to have a baseball name that would open doors, what better name than an Irish name? And so many of the ball players of that era were stars, were Irish in origin. And so he had some real success in the minor leagues in 1908, going undefeated for a Richmond team from Richmond, Virginia. And one of the Yankee scouts spotted him there, and that led to his being signed by New York.
And what about Emke? The start of Jack's career wasn't nearly as spectacular as Howard. So let's talk about Howard's early days. He was really young, not physically intimidating at all.
Yeah, he came from a middle class, if not an upper middle class family. His siblings, he had brothers that starred at Brown University, and he was going to go to Brown before he joined the Coast League team and had spectacular success in 1914. But here again, as sort of perhaps a hint of what was to come, I mean, he was considered a phenom. Of course, Quinn was also, with his undefeated 12-0 season in Richmond. But Emke had some problems, whether, again, it was his arm beginning to act up or whatever. And that 1914 season, there was a feeling at the end of it that he wasn't strong enough to really take the strain, of a full major league season, and that held him back from his promotion to the bigs.
Yeah. So after the 14 season, there was, they didn't know, could he pitch in the majors or not? And then there was maybe a little bit of a battle for his services, and he wound up going to the Federal League in 1915. And then in 1916, went to play for the Tigers, and he played for them in 16 and 17. And then Jack, his career was, obviously he had started earlier, played his first 5 seasons in the majors, 1909 through 1912 with the Yankees. Then in 1913, he played for the Boston Braves. And then in 1914, he went to the Federal League and just had this outstanding season. He went 26 and 14 and then fell flat the following season for Baltimore in the Federal League, going 9 and 22. So Quinn finishes his Federal League career in 1915. Emke also finishes in 1915, but Emke gets signed right away to play for Detroit. Jack Quinn had to wait 3 years before he got back into baseball. Why?
Yeah, Emke actually at first didn't get picked up, and he ended up going to a team in upstate New York where he had a strong and in one of the great minor league seasons in 1916, and then the Tigers noticed him. But both of them came out of the Federal League not that well. Emke in 1915 did virtually nothing. He had arm trouble virtually the entire year. He appeared in very few games. Quinn, as you said, had a great 1914 season, not as good in 15, although a lot of that had to do with his supporting cast. And so, Quinn, but, keep in mind, of course, at that time we didn't know exactly how old Quinn was, that's a whole other story because, where was his birth certificate? Being born in the Slovakian Republic.
Right. We should mention at that time he's listed as 31 years old.
Yeah. And, that's getting old for a ball player.
Mm-hmm.
And, I mean, quite frankly, when the Yankees released him in 1912, they were thinking, well, he's 29, about 29. So, a lot of players sort of as they approach 30, that's the end of their career. And Quinn did find a home in the Coast League with a club in Vernon, a small little community south of L.A. And he just, it's just like what Emke did, in upstate New York. He could not be ignored because he just pitched so well that he got he got another chance in the majors. And of course,
it was just a start.
Like
it was
Tigers.
Yeah, for Quinn, his career was just starting. It's crazy. How did World War I affect the Federal League and the American and National Leagues?
Well, the United States didn't join the war until 1917. We tried to maintain neutrality. We talk quite a bit about that, Lyle and I do in our book, The Colonel and Hug. And basically, it didn't affect things until 1918 because it took most of 1917 for the country to gear up, equipment-wise, training-wise. But in 1918, there was a shortened season because not that baseball had to shut down, but there were so many, young fans that were either worrying about the war or actually going off to fight that it ended up being a truncated season. Emke actually went into the armed forces, into the Navy. Quinn was older, and at least in the initial drafts, was not drafted because he was over the age of 30. And there was a pause there in 1918 because everything was focusing on the war in Europe.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's go back to Quinn for a moment because after being, for lack of a better term, blackballed from playing in the American or National Leagues again, he finally did get his chance to come back. But my gosh, the road back wasn't smooth. And when he finally made it back, it wasn't without controversy. In fact, this is the craziest story. Two teams claim they had the right to his services, the Yankees and the White Sox. And in fact, he was playing for the White Sox and beat the Yankees. So he beats the team that says they own his services. And what a mess. Tell us about that. I mean, the Yankees maintain they own his rights, but he's playing for the White Sox.
Well, it was a real complicated situation and an unfortunate one. And it had implications for baseball because the owner of the White Sox, Charles Comiskey, was really a power in the American League. And the American League president, Van Johnson, Comiskey's old buddy, awarded Quinn to the Yankees. Basically said, okay, Quinn came up in the end of 1918, pitched for the White Sox, like you said, even beat the Yankees, but he really belongs to New York. It was a really strange deal with a war going on. Major League Baseball said to teams, or said to players, work out your deal because the Coast League had shut down with players, however you can directly with the players. And it turned out right at that same day that the White Sox signed Quinn directly. The owners of the Vernon and the Los Angeles team of the Coast League said, let's have a little sort of championship postseason, shortened season series. And so all of a sudden, for another week, technically now Quinn was not out of work. He was still a member of the team. And that's when the Yankees made a deal, not directly with Quinn, but with the owners of the Vernon team. It was very complicated, and Comiskey never forgave his old friend Van Johnson for taking Quinn away. And a few years later, Johnson needed all the friends he could get, and he didn't have enough. And he was basically out of power as Commissioner Landis took over the running of the game.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you talk about that in pretty good detail in the book. So now back to Emke, when we look at his career, especially at this point of his career as he's getting back into the game in the late teens, early 20s, while he's growing as a pitcher, as we said earlier, he always had one bad inning or one bad spurt during his early days, and that cost him. I don't think he ever really developed into the pitcher that so many had predicted, the next Walter Johnson, the next Grover Cleveland Alexander. He was always getting high praise, even from umpires, but he never developed like they said he would.
Yeah, one of the things that I think makes our story pretty interesting is that the supporting cast are some pretty well-known and famous guys. In this case, Quinn and Emke are less well-known than really anyone that Lyle and I have written about before, such as Miller Huggins and Jacob Rupert of the Yankees. And one of the big figures that comes out here is Ty Cobb, as a player and then the manager of the Detroit Tigers. And we would suggest that arguably the conflict that Cobb and Emke had was one of the great conflicts between a manager and a player in baseball history. And they actually would have physical fights virtually every time they faced each other after Cobb got rid of him. But these were two very different.
But Steve, you also said in the beginning, though, they had a decent relationship and then it soured, correct?
Yeah, of course, at the beginning, Cobb was just a fellow ball player, and then he took over as manager in 1921. And Cobb, like so many intense and great athletes, just cannot countenance the personality of a guy who just seems more subdued, more reserved, more just not as intense, and that certainly didn't help Emke. Ultimately, it didn't help Cobb either, because Emke, the trade for the Tigers was really a very, very bad one that Cobb had pulled off there.
Yeah, did he screw up by trading Emke?
Well, he just they couldn't get along. So sometimes, you have to have guys that part, and we see it all the time in any sport. And I guess the team that trades the potential star away, they don't really wish him badly, but boy, if he does really well, then it makes you look bad. So it's a tough situation. But,
and ironically, they would become teammates again later.
Yeah, much later.
So back to Jack, like we do in the book, back and forth. He, again, fascinates me, especially his age. He also approached the game like a business, and you went into that a little bit before, kept in shape throughout the winter. So he usually got off to a good start. But when the weather heated up, his game sometimes would cool off. Is there anything to that?
That was a sort of a psychological thing, because usually when we look at psychology, we're talking more about Emke. Quinn, for a number of years in his career, he thought he couldn't win in the hot weather, which is really ironic, because his father, who came over from Europe to work in the anthracite coal mines of Pennsylvania, where you can only imagine how, the summers in Pennsylvania are already going to be pretty hot and humid, and you're down a mile underground or whatever. It's a tough life, and Quinn at times just felt that he couldn't win in the real hot weather, and there was no real explanation. Subsequently, he got better, and I think overcame that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Why was there so much concern about his age? I mean, either you can pitch or you can't pitch, and why was there also so much concern about where he came from and what his actual surname was?
Yeah, I think the big concern that baseball teams had was about his age, and I don't know if that bias against the aging athlete has really changed that much, but the athletes were famous in this time frame for lying about their age. We didn't have an internet, and we didn't have easy ways to check, and players would make themselves look younger. There was even a joke a Sporting News writer said at some point, as a player gets to be around 30, he mysteriously gets younger every year that he gets older, because, there's just a feeling he's going to lose effectiveness. He's more likely to get injured. And that was it. The mystery about his upbringing and where he came from was one that sports writers latched onto and really didn't get solved until all of this genealogical work was done. And if it weren't for the fact that the Eastern Orthodox Church in Slovakia kept, as many churches do, meticulous records, that we were able to nail that true origin down. But it sort of gave a certain mystique to him, to his story, sort of romancing his background. But yeah, the bias against age was, I think, goes back.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Back to Emke now. After the 1918, when he finally gets back into baseball, 1919, he goes 17-10 for the Tigers, follows that with a 15-18 season, goes 13-14, 17-17. And like you said, he and Cobb just didn't get along, so one of them had to go, and it's not going to be Emke. I mean, it's not going to be Cobb. It's going to be Emke. So they wind up, he winds up with Boston. And in his first year there, he goes 20-17 with a 3.78 ERA. He has a good season. When he was traded to the Red Sox, what happened to his game? Why was it different? What made him better?
It's a very good question. First of all, that Red Sox team was enormously bad. I'm trying to remember how many.
Yeah, not only right. Exactly. They were an awful team, but, and he won 20 games for them.
Yeah, it was just a breath of fresh air. He just felt, if you have a boss that you don't like and you're afraid that he doesn't like you, every day you go to work, perhaps, you just feeling a little tight, you can't relax. And I think just having the freedom that he had first, with Hugh Duffy and then actually, as long as it wasn't Cobb, Frank Chance, who was a very intense guy, the star of the great Cubs teams of the early century, became the manager, his manager for a while there in Boston. But he just let Emke be Emke and let him be a pitcher. I mean, Cobb was famous. There were incidents we'll even talk in detail about at least one of them where a pitcher would lose control and Cobb would call time and he'd run in from the outfield and he'd even say, how come you can't get over the plate? And he'd throw the ball over the plate or call first baseman Harry Howman over. Harry, throw the ball over the plate. And really, it's pretty tough if that's your boss. And so he just felt really more appreciated and relaxed.
Well, he had a great season. Like we said, he won 20 games. The Red Sox that year won 61. They were 61-91, so he won a third of their games. It's crazy. Yeah. Talk about his hesitation pitch. What was it? Explain it to us. Again, I try to compare things, and the closest thing that I can come up with to a hesitation pitch in a full windup would be Clayton Kershaw. I mean, the way he stops his leg, but I don't think that is indicative of what a hesitation pitch was.
Yeah, we don't have any film. There may be somewhere, some will be uncovered, and occasionally you do get some film from the 1920s that does surface and then goes on YouTube. But it was a pitch that he didn't use with a runner on first because there was a question of a balk. But I sometimes wondered, as Lyle and I worked on this book, why more pitchers don't try that, and that is the whole thing about hitting a baseball, or a big part of it is timing. Part of it is seeing the pitch, but part of it is timing. And he would just go into his windup, and as it was described, right when the batter is ready to pull the bat back to swing, at the top there, he might hesitate for a bit and just mess up the timing of the pitcher. He also did a very good job of sort of hiding the ball. And certainly with the away uniforms, which were gray, and sometimes the ball wasn't, bright white. Although after they banned a lot of the trick pitches, they did keep fresher, whiter balls, which helped hitters a lot. So it just was almost like a stutter step in his delivery that just messed up the hitters.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, both Quinn and Emke pitched at the end of the dead ball era. And again, I'm jumping around a lot here. I'm moving forward. We could go so much detail in your book. And if we go into everything, this will be a 3-hour podcast, which wouldn't bother me. But there'd be no reason for anybody to buy the book. So we're just hitting on some of the highlights. And
Right.
they both pitched at the end of the dead ball era and the advent of the lively ball era. Was there a dramatic difference in their games between the two eras?
Well, yeah, that's a whole discussion on its own. There was a very dramatic difference, and of course the spitball pitchers that were grandfathered had an increasingly nice advantage, and it's reflected in their numbers, because as there were fewer and fewer spitball pitchers, the hitters were less and less familiar with it and saw it less and less. And it is fascinating as these pitchers had to deal without a lot of these trick pitches. And the other thing is I touched on is the ball was replaced during the game much more often. And in the dead ball era, there might have been just 2 or 3 balls used during the game, and you can imagine how discolored it looked. Mm-hmm. And if pitchers were spitting on it and rubbing all kind of liniment or whatever on it, and then it's dirty. So it was tougher to be a pitcher in the 1920s, and the numbers dramatically reflect that.
Mm-hmm. Well, another name that comes to mind when reading your book, Comeback Pitchers, is that of Johnny Vandermeer. Emke's first season with Boston, 1923. Again, this guy has great potential, and perhaps he finally showed and or lived up to that potential when he pitched a no-hitter against Connie Mack's Philadelphia Athletics, a team, by the way, whom he had great success against throughout his career. And then he follows up that no-hitter with a very controversial one-hitter against the Yankees at Yankee Stadium. Talk about those 2 games.
Well, we often hear in sports that a referee or an umpire should make a call, like in basketball now that we may be following, a foul in the first quarter should be a foul in the fourth quarter. And the leadoff hitter, if Emke's game hit a ball that was ruled a hit that went to the third baseman, perhaps could have been ruled an error. Emke then went on to mow the Yankees down without giving up a hit. If it had been the 9th inning, in this case, the official scorer, who turned out to be one of the most famous baseball writers in the longest career, Fred Lieb. And Lieb just stood his ground. He said I ruled it an error, the first batter of the game, and I'm not going to change it. Had he changed it, or had he initially said it was an error, Emke's name would be known by virtually every baseball fan out there as pitching back-to-back no-hitters long before Johnny Vandermeer did it many years later.
Yeah, I mean, it's the way you covered it, and the way you discuss it, it's a great story, and it's a shame because I think the scorer, sort of admits later on, he had reservations later on about whether or not it really was a hit or an error.
Yeah, Fred Lee did have reservations, but here's one of the great ironies. His first no-hitter that you touch on against the A's was only a no-hitter because a runner, I think it was the opposing pitcher, hit a double and forgot to touch first base. He was so excited when he hit his double off the wall. So Emke got that first game, not a gift from an umpire or a scorer, but how often do you see a no-hitter broken up, and then it turns out that the runner forgot to, ran over first base and never stepped on it. So I don't know if it evened out.
Well, let's go now, and we're going to talk about the Philadelphia Athletics. And that's a team, that's a franchise that a lot of people don't realize how good the Athletics have been over the years. They won 3 out of 4 years in the early, 1910, 11, 12, 13, 14, somewhere's in there. And then they fell on hard times. Connie Mack always liked Emke and Quinn, And finally, in trying to rebuild his team, he got both of them. And there was criticism, as Quinn at that time was reportedly 41 and Emke was 32. And neither of them were pitching extraordinarily well, let's say. Yet Mac wanted them. And the following 4 years, I think, were probably the best years of each man's career. And I say Quinn was reportedly 41 because we've touched upon it. No one ever really knew his age, maybe even Quinn himself. Talk about the Philadelphia Athletics. Probably these were the best, the most competitive years of Quinn's and Emke's careers as far as being in pennant races every year. And that's where they actually played their, this was the second go-round for them to be on the same team. And it was quite a time.
Yeah, it was, Connie Mack had built up, as you said, the teams of the early 20th century, 1905, 1910, 11, 13, 14. And he did it by bringing a lot of, he had a lot of these sort of informal scouts out there, and he thought he could rebuild that quickly again, and he couldn't, because now every team was looking for good players, and he had the worst team in baseball for a number of years, from the mid to late teens into the early 20s, and he started climbing again only by actually laying out big dollars. He paid, I think it was $100 more to get Lefty Grove than the Yankees paid Boston to get Babe Ruth. He paid a lot of money to get Mickey Cochran, I believe, from Portland. And the Jimmy Fox thing was, I think, a little bit more of luck or foresight. But he was building the team up, and he thought that he saw something in Quinn and Emke. He also saw that he had a very young team, and he wanted veteran leadership. And unfortunately, he had to wait a few years, and Quinn and Emke did, because right around that time that they joined the A's, the Yankees, were having their second rebirth of the 1920s, and certainly the cap by 27, they were not going to be denied. But Quinn and Emke had, and Emke's perhaps Quinn's best season might have been 28 when the A's fell just short of the pennant.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that 28 season, Quinn did have a heck of a year. He was, I got that right here, 18-7. But the following year, 29, I think, is probably the most gratifying year for each man. Sure, Quinn made a World Series earlier with the Yankees. I think it was 1921. But in 29, after, this great 1928 for Quinn, he goes 11-9. Emke was only 7-2 in 1929 and was nearly let go by Connie Mack earlier in the season, but he made a deal with Connie Mack. Tell us about the deal and the fact that Mack almost reneged on the deal.
Yeah, there have been so many stories about the background to quote-unquote the deal. And Connie Mack was a master psychologist, and that certainly made him different from other managers out there. He never criticized a player in public, and he told Emke that Emke just wasn't cutting it. Well, part of it may have been Emke's arm, part of it might have been mental. And Emke told him that I've got one great game left in this arm, and Emke had to show it to him during the end of the regular season. And Mack made what at the time would be thought of as an absurd decision that he was going to start Emke, this guy that only pitched 9 games during the season, in Game 1 of the World Series. And nobody, thought that was possible. And as it was unfolding, I think even his own players thought Connie Mack had gone crazy. Al Simmons was one who famously was just in shock when it turned out that Emke was going to start that game. And Connie Mack later on called that day his greatest day in baseball. There's a little book that came out in the 40s, My Greatest Day in Baseball, and it was that day that he started Howard Emke in Game 1 against the powerful Chicago Cubs.
Well, he lets him pitch. For some, like you said, it was a surprise. For others, they had a hunch because one of the things that Emke did, and this wasn't the first time that Emke had been sent home and told to rest up and get yourself healthy and figure out, how to pitch again. And he went and he watched the Cubs play against the Phillies. I think it was at the Baker Bowl. He saw them play against the Phillies, and he was taking notes. And people were like, why is Howard Emke here taking notes? So some people might have had a hunch that something was going on. And that Game 1 of the World Series, Howard Emke was simply phenomenal. He struck out a record 13 batters that day, and that was a record, I believe, in the World Series that lasted for a couple of decades. But not only did he strike out 13 ball players, 12 were swinging. So he had his stuff that day. And, as you had brought up in the book, his arm was basically numb. And based on Emke's description of his arm, that probably should have been the last game of his career. He should have walked out a champion that day and walked out with his head held high. So, again, tell us a little more about that game he pitched at that time, one of the greatest pitching performances in World Series history.
Right. I mean, Connie Mack was brilliant for two reasons. Number one, he knew how to motivate Emke, because he said, hey, I'm going to send you down to the minors. And Emke said, give me a chance. But number two, and more importantly, is the fact that they were playing the Chicago Cubs in Wrigley Field. And the Cubs were stacked with fastball hitters. Hack Wilson, one of the most powerful hitters of all time, Roger Hornsby, even Charlie Grimm. I mean, these guys were just, they were fastball pitchers, and they knew they were going to see some real heat from Philadelphia. And instead, this junk ball pitcher, the coach of Emke, the coach of the Chicago Cubs, Joe McCarthy, who later on went to the Yankees, and I'm not going to mention the word here, but we actually have it in the book. He used the four-letter word to describe Emke's pitching style, and it means sort of junk, or garbage, or something worse than that. We'll leave it at that. And, they were just anxiously waiting fastballs, because Lefty Grove and George Earnshaw were two of the fastest pitchers in the game. And here comes this guy. And Emke had a little bit of a rough start, because the beginning of the game got held up about, I think it was 15 or 20 minutes because of the traffic jam. And Commissioner Landis said, let's wait for everybody to get here. Otherwise, Emke felt, he would have started even smoother. And he just had them baffling. I mean, I wish we could have film of that game, because you really were seeing some of the great hitters of the game. I think Hornsby might have struck out 3 times, if I'm positive, in that game. And they just, again, maybe it's like Jamie Moyer again, you go back to the dugout saying, how the heck did I not hit that guy? I mean, what's going on here? And 13 strikeouts broke, I think it was Ed Walsh's record with the 06 White Sox.
And again, he should have walked away a champion. But once again, he convinced Connie Mack to let him come back in 1930 and not cut him loose. But how did he talk him into letting him come back, and then finally it was over?
Yeah, well, the other thing, he also talked Connie Mack into letting him start what turned out to be the final game of the World Series, and he was rocked. So Mack wasn't perfect, and luckily, I guess you could say that history sort of has conveniently and graciously forgotten about those that almost glorious ending that and most people that even know of the Emke game think, well, that was his last game. That was his last win. But, it wasn't his last game. And Quinn pitched in that World Series also. And ironically, Quinn pitched, and that Emke game is considered one of the most famous games of all time in the World Series. And Quinn actually pitched in one of the most famous games in World Series history, but he's not remembered as for what he did. And it was the game in which he left with his team was way behind, and the A's were behind the Cubs late, 8-0, and rallied to win 10-8, the greatest comeback in World Series history. Basically, we mentioned the fact that this actually led to William Wrigley, the chewing gum magnate, losing confidence in manager Joe McCarthy, and the Yankees benefiting for a decade from that. So two of the most famous games of World Series history were both in 29. Quinn's name is all over one of them, but forgotten, and Emke's is over the other one.
Well, the 29 season, obviously, for both of them had such a great end to it. 1930, Emke was finally let go. Quinn did play for the A's or the Athletics in 29 and 30, got 2 World Series championships there. And he kept on going, Quinn did, and played into the 1933 season when he was 49. Just amazing. And he always said he wanted to pitch until he was 50, and who knows, he actually might have if we could ever figure out what his real age was. Talk about the end of his career.
I think we did pretty much nail down that he did make it to 50. He was with the Cincinnati Reds, barely hanging on there, because we were able to nail down his date of birth from his baptism certificate in the Eastern Orthodox Church over in a little village in Slovakia. And, he became a very, very dependable relief pitcher, led the National League in saves. I mean, saves wasn't a statistic then, but retroactively, it's been computed and it shows up in all the records. And, he continued to be very, very good. And he went to the National League with the Brooklyn team.
Well, Steve, again, so much was covered in your book. I really enjoyed it. Comeback pitchers, the remarkable careers of Howard Ehmke and Jack Quinn from the University of Nebraska Press. So much, including how umpires actually wrote articles back then, and they commented on players. You'd never see that today. Harry Frazee and his terrible mismanagement of the Red Sox. Much more about Cobb and Emke, the mystery around Quinn, his age, his real surname. Just an incredible amount of information. Is there anything else that you want to say on today's podcast that we haven't covered that you think is too important before we wrap things up?
Well, I would just add that one of the fascinating parts of the book is the 1928 season. The great 27 Yankees came out in 28 with a roaring start. They had an enormous lead by mid-season, and the A's, with Quinn and Emke's help, and that was when Quinn won 18 games, came storming back and actually took over first place and set the stage for a game that I discussed in my Urban Shocker book, because it was the very day that the great Yankee pitcher Urban Shocker died in a Denver hospital. And on that day, late in the season, the Yankees, in second place, swept the A's in a doubleheader at Yankee Stadium for an enormous crowd, and went on to just hang on for the pennant and deny Connie Mack and made him wait until 29. But certainly Babe Ruth is surfaces repeatedly in the book, both as a teammate of Quinn in 21 and 20, and as an opponent in the later years.
Yeah, in fact, he had a lot of good things to say about Emke and Quinn, but I was actually surprised how much good he had to say about Emke. Hey, Steve, what are you working on next? You have any ideas?
Well, we do, but we're just waiting a bit to talk about it. Lyle and I are doing another collaboration together, and we're returning to New York with this story, and we're going back even a little bit more in time, and we don't churn out books that quickly, so it's going to be a while. But hopefully there will be another collaboration, number 4, and it should be exciting.
Well, Steve, I want to thank you again so much for joining me on Sports Forgotten Heroes. Like I said, I could ask you so many more questions, but I think we covered a good amount, touched the surface on a good amount, and I hope people out there buy the book because it is detailed, goes into a lot, tells you a lot about two guys. Neither are Hall of Famers, but they certainly had great and very interesting careers.
Well, these are guys that just fit the name of your show, perfectly, because they have amazing stories and they've been really forgotten. And Lyle and I love to bring them back to life, so to speak, and give them a little bit of the spotlight that they so richly deserve.
You got it, Steve. Anytime. Again, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Jack Quinn put together one heck of a career. He won 247 games and saved 56. His best year might have been 1914 when, for the Baltimore Terrapins of the Federal League, he was 26-14 with a 2.60 ERA in 342 2/3 innings. Always in shape, Quinn was a marvel, pitching for 23 years. Emke pitched 15 years, missing the 1918 season. His overall record was 166 wins and 166 losses with 15 saves. If not for the decision of the official scorer, he might be better known as the first man to pitch back-to-back no-hitters. And what he did in Game 1 of the 1929 World Series is still one of the greatest performances in baseball history. Once again, I'd like to thank the University of Nebraska Press for sending a copy of the new book, Comeback Pitchers, The Remarkable Careers of Howard Ehmke and Jack Quinn, by today's guest, Steve Steinberg, and his co-author, Lyle Spatz. Next time on Sports Forgotten Heroes, a new special series will start. Periodically, I will be bringing on a guest to talk about a sports palace no longer with us. First up, Milwaukee County Stadium. That's next time. For now, thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time on Sports Forgotten Heroes.
We here at the Sports History Network proudly partner with 26 podcasts, all revolving around the history of sports. But did you know that many of our hosts were sports history authors way before they started their shows? It's true. We've got Joe Ziemba, host of When Football Was Football, Joe Zagurski, host of Pro Football in the 1970s, Mark Morthier, host of Yesterday Sports, Tommy Phillips, host of Lombardi Memories, and Scott Adamson, co-host of From the 55-Yard Line. All these authors have many books for you to choose from. To check them out, go to our website at sportshistorynetwork.com/sportshistorybooks. Pick up your copy today. Soundtrack provided by Kevin MacLeod of filmmusic.io.